The noise escaping Kamala Harris's lips was less a coherent word and more a sharp intake of breath, resembling the reaction of someone who just took a physical blow to the gut and remains unsure if they should weep or retaliate. 30 million American citizens listened to this broadcast live. 22 distinct microphones positioned throughout the Senate chamber captured the noise. The official stenographer simply typed the phrase indicating an indistinguishable noise, entirely avoiding brackets, as no proper English vocabulary could adequately describe the self-inflicted damage the former vice president had just committed on a nationwide broadcast. Just 3 minutes prior, she appeared absolutely poised, yet she was now emitting an indescribable noise while the military-clad woman seated 12 feet across from her, the very person responsible for this reaction, continued her uninterrupted testimony. Here is exactly how the situation unfolded. An hour and a half prior to that dramatic moment, the committee chamber was gradually reaching its capacity. The digital timepiece mounted above the main entrance displayed 9:58. 2 minutes prior to the opening gavel, Director of National Intelligence and Lieutenant Colonel Tulsi Gabbard took her seat at the witness desk wearing her formal military attire, displaying silver eagles and a combat infantry badge, with her hands resting calmly atop an unopened crimson file. Positioned before her were a solitary microphone, an untouched beverage, and a dozen feet of gleaming wooden table stretching toward an entirely vacant seat. That specific seat remained unoccupied simply because Kamala Harris had not yet arrived. Proceedings were officially mandated to commence precisely at 10 o'clock. Her administrative team had officially verified her planned appearance on 3 separate occasions. The presiding committee leader delayed the starting strike for a full 60 seconds, stretching the pause to a minute and a half and finally to 2 minutes. At 2 minutes past the hour, Gabbard moved closer to her audio equipment and initiated her remarks. She commenced her testimony by directing her words straight toward the vacant leather seat. Noting that the vice president's spot was completely bare, Gabbard spoke with a remarkably steady and disciplined tone, characteristic of an individual who discovered in foreign combat zones that a composed demeanor is absolutely critical for maintaining order. She noted this absence was incredibly poetic, given that the defendants targeted by her prosecutorial administration experienced a similar lack of presence. During times requiring absolute fairness, she remained missing. During moments demanding profound compassion, she stayed away, and even when judicial mandates demanded their freedom, she was nowhere to be found. Unsealing her crimson dossier, she announced her intention to proceed independently by focusing exclusively on individual identities, rather than broad legislative arguments or numerical metrics, emphasizing that every single figure represented a real citizen with a distinct identity. She announced the initial entry as Darnell Jackson, a 22-year-old from San Francisco's Tenderloin neighborhood who faced 14 months of incarceration over merely 6 grams of cannabis. Moving down the list, she named 19-year-old Maria Reyes of the Mission District, penalized 8 months for 4 grams, followed by 31-year-old Tyrone Washington from Bayview, who received 2 years for a minor 9-gram stash inaccurately framed as distribution material. She relentlessly continued reciting consecutive individuals, ages, home districts, and precise prison terms without any hesitation. Her cadence was intentionally methodical, echoing a solemn military roll call or a somber tribute to obligations presented directly to an audience entirely unaccustomed to bearing such heavy societal costs. At precisely 12 minutes past the hour, the heavy rear entrance of the legislative room finally swung wide. The entire gathered audience pivoted toward the distinct noise of a metallic lock disengaging, immediately accompanied by the unmistakable sharp clicking of premium footwear striking the stone floor. Kamala Harris strolled into the formal space behaving as though she had arrived well ahead of schedule. Maintaining flawless bodily alignment and wearing an utterly pristine outfit, the signature pearl jewelry she had favored for 3 decades brilliantly reflected the room's bright illumination. She navigated the crowded aisle exhibiting the highly refined self-assurance of a professional accustomed to making powerful entrances into environments where subordinates were entirely obligated to anticipate her arrival. She remained entirely oblivious to the fact that Gabbard had spent the previous 12 minutes formally reciting criminal records. She was completely unaware that numerous broadcast lenses had aggressively documented her vacant seat. She had absolutely no idea that digital platforms were already viral with discussions about her absence, sparked by tens of millions of viewers watching a senior intelligence official list persecuted individuals to an unoccupied piece of furniture. The witness maintained her steady vocal delivery without any interruption. She announced Marcus Williams, a 28-year-old from Bayview, penalized with a 3-year sentence for 11 grams. From the furthest seating section, a gentleman rose to his feet in a non-theatrical, unhurried manner, elevating himself much like a congregant responding to a clergy member, driven by an innate physical obligation to acknowledge his own recognition before conscious thought intervened. This particular individual was the aforementioned Marcus Williams. He had now reached the age of 41. He wore a neatly pressed collared garment that his mother had meticulously prepared before dawn. He endured a full 3-year term inside a state correctional facility solely for holding 11 grams of cannabis. At the start of his incarceration, he maintained a marriage, stable employment, and a valid housing agreement. Upon his release, his only remaining possessions were a severe criminal classification and a simple transit pass. His maternal caregiver, Dorothy, remained seated directly adjacent to him. Instead of rising, she gently rested her palm against his sleeve, utilizing the universal maternal gesture meant to reassure offspring that they remain visible and valued in an otherwise indifferent society. Gabbard shifted her gaze from the man to the newly arrived politician, who was casually taking her seat, modifying her audio equipment, and organizing her documents with the calm exactness of an authority figure anticipating total command over the impending dialogue. Acknowledging the late arrival, Gabbard pointed out that since the man had already endured a 9-year delay, asking him to hold on for an additional 12 minutes was a minor inconvenience. The politician's signature grin, utilized primarily as a defensive shield that materialized for broadcasts and vanished in private, wavered briefly, allowing front-row photographers a split-second glimpse before the witness methodically advanced to the subsequent document. The subsequent events represented a complete anomaly in contemporary legislative history, originating with an audio transmission that definitely did not belong to the seated witness. Addressing the presiding leader, the official requested permission to broadcast an audio file supplied by a former state prosecutor's employee, emphasizing its rigorous validation by multiple independent technical labs and an undisputed chain of custody available to all present members. Dipping her hand beneath the desk surface, she retrieved a compact electronic listening device. After elevating the gadget for optimal media visibility, she placed it securely on the wood and engaged the playback function. The vocal tones emanating from the tiny speaker were absolutely indisputable. It belonged to the same individual who had spoken at major global summits, broadcasted nationwide political concessions, and sparred during executive-level public forums. The room heard Kamala Harris herself, secretly taped within her private workspace addressing her internal administrative team. The recording captured her acknowledging judicial orders while simultaneously demanding her legal team intentionally stall inmate releases, explicitly citing the critical need to retain those specific individuals as a captive workforce for upcoming seasonal wildfire containment. The captured audio clip spanned a mere 11 seconds in total. The absolute quiet that immediately followed stretched out significantly longer than the clip itself. The specific term resonating in everyone's mind was not related to forestry or stalling tactics, but rather her crude commodification of human forms. The former top state lawyer, someone who branded herself an innovative reformer, actively courted minority demographics with promises to dismantle systemic imprisonment and heavily promoted equality, had casually reduced nonviolent inmates to mere manual resources and logistical inventory rather than human beings deserving liberty. Furthermore, she had explicitly commanded her subordinates to undermine a direct federal judicial mandate. Gabbard intentionally allowed the heavy quiet to linger unbroken. Drawing upon extensive tactical debriefings and questioning sessions, she recognized that the absolute most effective strategy following such a devastating audio revelation is maintaining complete and utter stillness to let the facts resonate unassisted. She waited 5, then 10, then 15 seconds before resuming her testimony. She noted that in the year 2014, a federal legal panel mandated a significant reduction in the state's overcrowded inmate numbers. Regional detention centers were bursting beyond capacity to a degree that directly breached constitutional protections against inhumane treatment. The judicial branch formally required an accelerated discharge protocol for individuals holding minor, peaceful convictions. Your department aggressively contested this directive, not utilizing statutory arguments but relying entirely on workforce retention justifications. Your legal representative submitted documentation asserting that liberating these peaceful inmates would critically damage the operational capacity of emergency forestry units, using exact phrasing to that effect. The state relied heavily on their physical efforts to combat regional blazes, prompting your team to advocate for their continued mandated incarceration. Once this strategy leaked to media outlets, you publicly expressed sheer astonishment and claimed total ignorance regarding that specific legal approach. Gesturing toward the compact device, the witness reminded the room that the audio clearly demonstrated a direct order to deliberately obstruct the emancipation process. Such an action does not represent surprise or lack of awareness, but rather an explicit command from the state's highest prosecutor to sabotage a federal ruling strictly to preserve an inexpensive workforce. Moreover, this occurrence was definitely not a singular anomalous event. Investigative journalism revealed that your specific department habitually ignored the highest court's mandates regarding facility depopulation. Presiding magistrates openly blasted your procedural maneuvers as intentionally evasive, bringing the entire regional government dangerously close to a formal contempt citation. Your prosecutorial leadership dragged the national legal system toward an unprecedented jurisdictional breakdown simply because you refused to discharge citizens who had rightfully completed their assigned penalties. A specific individual named Daniel Larson was legally declared completely blameless by a federal magistrate, not merely possessing reasonable doubt but entirely exonerated of all wrongdoing. Despite this definitive judicial ruling clearing his name, your legal team aggressively litigated to maintain his imprisonment based on a minor procedural loophole. Because he overlooked a paperwork schedule, your official stance argued that an admittedly faultless man belonged behind bars solely due to administrative tardiness. This behavior completely abandons any concept of fairness, representing nothing short of profound sadism masked by legal credentials. Her legal counsel tilted forward to speak softly, prompting a rigid, dismissive headshake indicating both a desire for silence and a total lack of immediate strategic options. The witness concluded that specific topic and transitioned seamlessly to her following point. She declared that the most damaging proof against the politician did not emerge from her own documents, legal transcripts, leaked audio, or journalistic inquiries. Halting briefly for effect, she emphasized that the ultimate indictment came directly from the accused herself. Following a subtle gesture to her assistant, the chamber's large video screens instantly activated. However, the core narrative focused not on the technology itself, but rather on perfectly sequenced verbal statements that highlighted glaring hypocrisies too obvious to brush aside. The initial video snippet originated from a 2014 media briefing held in the state capitol. Positioned firmly behind a lectern bearing the official prosecutorial crest, her tone resonated with absolute certainty. She proudly declared herself the state's ultimate law enforcement officer, boasting about implementing the nation's most rigid and successful narcotics suppression strategies. Engaging another control switch, a subsequent clip rolled from a 2020 broadcast featuring an alternative setting and demographic, yet identical unwavering confidence from the same speaker. In this instance, she firmly denied ever supporting widespread imprisonment, claiming such a stance was completely foreign to her historical record. Addressing the panel, the witness noted that these contrasting, passionately delivered and publicly broadcasted assertions were intended as absolute facts, despite being mutually exclusive. Either she genuinely embraced her aggressive prosecutorial title or she consistently opposed heavy imprisonment, as claiming simultaneous dedication to both philosophies is logically impossible. She advised the room to internalize that contradiction before presenting an even more egregious example. The third segment featured a 2010 local radio appearance outlining her aggressive narcotic penalization tactics. She vowed to pursue cannabis infractions relentlessly, framing the harsh approach as vital community defense and an unambiguous deterrent. The fourth media snippet presented an entirely distinct radio interview conducted during the year 2019. When the interviewer posed a direct inquiry regarding her personal use of the controversial plant, she candidly admitted to partaking and fully ingesting the smoke. The observing crowd emitted a collective noise resting somewhere between a shocked intake of breath and a chuckle, typical of people finally receiving verbal confirmation of a deeply held, cynical suspicion. Maintaining a stern expression and avoiding any subjective commentary, the witness flatly announced the figure of 1,560. This specific numerical value represented the exact count of citizens incarcerated for cannabis violations throughout her entire tenure as a leading state prosecutor. Over 1,500 individuals found themselves confined behind steel bars for participating in the exact same recreational activity the prosecuting official humorously reminisced about over public airwaves. She hesitated intentionally, allowing the sheer scale of the statistics to fully resonate with the audience. She clarified that this behavior transcends standard hypocrisy, which generally involves merely contradicting one's own stated principles. This scenario represents a far darker reality where a person aggressively ruins the futures of citizens for engaging in actions they personally enjoyed without consequence. Across every global society and linguistic tradition, a specific derogatory term exists to universally classify this exact manifestation of supreme moral weakness. The subsequent set of video segments concentrated directly on international boundary policies. A 2021 recording showed her projecting executive authority from a Central American stage, repeatedly warning migrants against traveling north and insisting federal statutes would be rigorously upheld. Following that speech, a visual graphic projected a solitary, massive figure of 8.2 million. This colossal metric quantified the total undocumented entry events recorded under the current executive leadership team. Over 8 million individuals successfully arrived and bypassed security along the precise geographic perimeter the vice president was explicitly commissioned to regulate. Emphasizing the stark contrast, Gabbard pointed out that despite the verbal warnings to stay away, millions fundamentally ignored the directive and arrived anyway. Over that same 4-year span, 110,000 domestic citizens perished from illicit narcotics that flowed effortlessly across the very boundary she was tasked with barricading. Next played the infamous television network interview segment that had persistently damaged her professional reputation. The veteran journalist posed an incredibly basic inquiry regarding her continuous failure to physically inspect the region she was officially appointed to oversee. Her recorded response, accompanied by that familiar defensive chuckle utilized whenever reality became uncomfortable, flippantly compared her localized negligence to an irrelevant lack of overseas European travel. The witness permitted the video file to run through its complete duration. She allowed the unsettling sound of the recorded chuckle to linger heavily throughout the chamber atmosphere. After powering down the display panel and plunging the screen into blackness, she utilized the quiet space to deliver an entirely unscripted observation. An immense multitude of households lost cherished relatives to toxic drug exposure, including parents and youths who mistakenly consumed tampered recreational pills and perished instantly before emergency responders could intervene. Yet, when questioned about her absence from the epicenter of this crisis, the responsible official callously equated the disaster zone to a missed transatlantic holiday. The military officer formally shut her crimson dossier. She declared that prosecuting the politician was entirely unnecessary, as the official had just thoroughly indicted herself using her own authentic vocal recordings and on-screen statements. My only active contribution was simply engaging the playback function. The accused remained perfectly rigid as her lawyer attempted another hushed consultation, though this time she offered zero physical response or gesture of acknowledgement. Both hands were plastered firmly onto the polished wood, creating an anchor meant to prevent any microscopic twitch that could betray the profound internal panic she desperately needed to conceal. From the spectator section, the formerly incarcerated man observed the entire spectacle from his assigned chair. He remained perfectly stationary since taking his position, with his caregiver's palm continuing to rest reassuringly against his bicep. He intensely monitored the exact individual responsible for his prolonged imprisonment as she publicly experienced the devastating impact of weaponized personal statements. He was intimately familiar with that crushing sensation, having endured a nearly identical nightmare within a coastal justice hall nearly a decade prior. The crucial distinction lay in the outcome, as his statements resulted in physical captivity, whereas hers were currently ensuring her permanent professional disgrace. He genuinely struggled to determine which ultimate fate was more agonizing. The presiding official mandated a rapid 5-minute intermission for the proceedings. The chamber rapidly swelled with the hushed chatter of journalists filing audio dispatches, aides urgently consulting legislators, and the undeniable ambient tension signifying a truly historic, generational political event unfolding in real time. As the wooden mallet struck to resume the session, the intelligence director ignored her documents and instead pivoted toward the public seating area. Requesting permission from the committee head, she sought to formally introduce an individual she had referenced earlier, emphasizing his nearly decade-long wait for this precise vocal opportunity. She formally petitioned the panel to grant the formerly imprisoned citizen direct speaking privileges. The politician's primary legal defender partially stood up, vehemently objecting that this unexpected individual lacked prior administrative clearance for testimony. After silently observing all involved parties, the presiding leader rejected the procedural complaint and explicitly invited the man to approach the front desk. Rising steadily, he engaged his suit buttons out of pure maternal-instilled habit and proceeded directly down the central walkway. His footwear was meticulously polished yet visibly aged, representing the standard aesthetic of an individual striving for dignity despite severe financial limitations. Their muted impact against the floor fabric created a subtle noise that paradoxically resonated with far greater emotional volume than any bureaucratic speech delivered during the entire session. He carefully settled himself into the designated testimonial seat. He arrived completely devoid of pre-written remarks, legal representation, reference materials, organized files, support staff, or even basic hydration provisions. His sole assets were a freshly pressed collared shirt prepared before dawn and a traumatic personal history he had harbored for nearly a decade. Offering an encouraging gesture, Gabbard invited him to share his experiences completely unhurried and using his preferred phrasing. Upon speaking, his volume was exceptionally low, reflecting not anxiety, but the drained composure of someone who has internally practiced a monologue so frequently that all passionate intensity has been completely exhausted. I received a 36-month penalty for possessing 11 grams. Prior to lockup, I maintained residential housing in a specific neighborhood, held steady logistics employment, and shared my life with a devoted partner who promised romantic loyalty. Stopping briefly, he clarified that her patience lasted exactly 11 months. I harbor no resentment toward her, as nearly a year is a tremendous duration to remain committed to someone officially branded as a societal menace by the regional government. Upon my ultimate release, my housing, my employment, and my relationship had completely evaporated. Carrying a severe criminal brand permanently disqualified me from standard housing, mainstream career opportunities, and democratic participation, all stemming from a tiny amount of a botanical compound that the penalizing state now freely permits. He paused to respire, allowing the sensitive audio equipment to broadcast a heavy, drawn-out release of oxygen laden with profound psychological weight. However, those systemic injustices are not my primary motivation for appearing today. Pivoting his gaze directly toward the politician seated across the room, he observed her maintaining locked fingers and a stubbornly downward visual focus. My presence is exclusively due to auditing your broadcasted interview where you chuckled gleefully regarding your own narcotic consumption. I was actively performing janitorial labor inside a maximum security compound when a correctional officer deliberately amplified that exact audio clip for the entire inmate population to absorb. The guard's explicit intention was ensuring we recognized that the very architect of our imprisonment found humor in participating in the precise behaviors that stripped us of our freedom. My fellow incarcerated peers offered zero verbal response, completely abstaining from both profanity and violent outbursts. The reaction was infinitely more devastating. It was the absolute silence of degraded individuals realizing their chief oppressor was publicly mocking them from a position of luxurious liberty while they engaged in forced menial labor. The legislative chamber descended into a profound hush so deep that the mechanical HVAC circulation, the minor biological noises of the assembled journalists, and the subtle electrical vibrations of dozens of broadcast lenses became the only detectable sounds. I completed my mandated sentence without vocal protest, legally challenging the verdict, or creating any institutional friction whatsoever. I simply performed my chores, tracked the passing calendar dates, secured my release, and painstakingly reconstructed my existence. Securing reliable employment required over half a decade of relentless effort, simply because a severe criminal brand clings to your identity like a persistent silhouette that defies all attempts at evasion. Even during your most successful and optimistic moments, that permanent dark marker remains firmly attached to your background. He paused once more before delivering a sequence of words entirely absent from any predetermined strategy or late-night practice session. He vocalized this brief phrase solely due to a 9-year buildup, speaking with a soft, cautious tone typical of requesting basic dignity that experience has taught you will likely be denied. Please, merely grant me eye contact. The politician refused to elevate her gaze, stubbornly analyzing the wooden grain, the faint moisture stains from a relocated beverage, or quite literally anything besides the visage of the human being whose future she had callously sacrificed for a bureaucratic statistical advantage. 3 full moments elapsed, slowly stretching into 5. The lack of ambient noise became so intensely oppressive that it created a distinct physical pressure against the auditory canals of everyone present. Suddenly, from the public observation tier, the man's mother finally broke the tension. She refrained completely from yelling or raising her volume to an aggressive level. Her tone projected the unbreakable command of a solitary parent who navigated impoverished urban survival, endured endless weekend commutes just to reassure her incarcerated child through reinforced barriers that he still mattered to an indifferent society, and meticulously prepared his garments before dawn precisely for this long-awaited moment of public visibility. Focus your visual attention on him right now. This was neither a polite inquiry nor a partisan maneuver. It was a primal maternal command carrying an ancient resonance far superseding modern jurisprudence, legislative posturing, and the bureaucratic authority of the nation's capital, rendering it absolutely impossible to ignore. Yielding to the command, the official raised her head to lock gazes with her former victim, bridging the physical gap in a decade of unspoken trauma. The exonerated man maintained the visual connection with unwavering intensity, broadcasting neither rage nor desperation, but simply absolute, undeniable existence. It was the stare of an individual repeatedly reduced to nothingness, demanding just a single moment of basic recognition from the exact authority figure who had engineered his erasure. The politician maintained the uncomfortable stare for 4 excruciating ticks of the clock, a duration that psychologically stretched into hours for the captivated onlookers. Her mouth unsealed infinitesimally, signaling a potential justification or expression of remorse, yet absolutely zero audio materialized. Subsequently, she violently redirected her visual focus back toward the table. The man offered a subtle affirmative head gesture, completely devoid of smugness or victory, serving merely as a depressing validation of his existing theories. He had achieved his sole objective by peering directly into the soul of his former persecutor, discovering exactly the barren void he anticipated, a total absence of empathy or familiarity, replaced entirely by a desperate internal mathematical assessment of impending political ruin. "I figured as much," he softly muttered. He rose steadily to his feet. He re-engaged his jacket buttons, relying on the same ingrained physical habit instilled by his maternal upbringing. He returned directly to his designated public seating assignment. His footwear generated the identical soft rustling against the woven floor covering. Dorothy grasped his fingers the moment he settled back down. She refrained from offering any vocal commentary. She recognized words were entirely unnecessary. The official judicial transcriptionist openly shed tears. A legislative representative seated nearby pressed a heavy palm firmly against his brow. A broadcast operator paused his equipment to gaze at the exonerated man, realizing he had almost missed the most profoundly significant event he would ever document because he was distracted by technical adjustments. Gabbard delayed her continuation until the citizen was comfortably situated. Subsequently, she redirected her attention toward the politician. "I express my gratitude to the witness. Please ensure the official transcript notes that this man explicitly requested basic eye contact from the former vice president. Please also document her complete inability to comply." Gabbard refocused on her assembled documentation. What ensued was a recitation resembling dramatic fiction but entirely verified by judicial transcripts, financial disclosures, and law enforcement summaries. Every individual named was undeniably real. Every singular criminal allegation was officially cataloged. Every single resolution existed as openly accessible public data. In the summer of 2020, Gabbard noted, a regional justice fund initiated a massive financial drive to secure the release of incarcerated demonstrators. Kamala Harris, actively seeking higher executive office at the time, publicly instructed her massive digital following to financially support this specific initiative. She displayed a physical printout confirming this digital communication. Her precise wording encouraged citizens to contribute resources toward bailing out individuals protesting locally. "Madam Vice President, I completely respect your ideological commitment to systemic justice restructuring, as that remains a valid legislative discussion. What I challenge is your awareness regarding the actual beneficiaries of those funds, because the following individuals directly profited." She recited the initial entry of Thomas Mosley, indicted for severe homicide, whose liberty was purchased by this organization. He walked free despite facing premier murder allegations. She allowed the devastating criminal classification to linger heavily. Subsequently, she listed Jalil Stallings, indicted for attempting to assassinate a law enforcement officer who similarly secured his release through these identical funds. Furthermore, she mentioned Christopher Boswell, facing multiple severe sexual assault charges, who also profited from this exact financial pool. Moreover, she highlighted Timothy Wayne, a chronic domestic abuser with established history, whose bail was covered by this same charity. He gained his freedom and incurred fresh charges within a matter of weeks. An anonymous juvenile offender facing horrific allegations regarding a child victim also saw his bond satisfied by this organization. Gabbard ceased her continuous recitation. She secured her crimson dossier shut. She positioned her palms flat against the wood and leaned in deliberately, ensuring the audio equipment captured her articulation flawlessly. "I present 5 distinct individuals, including a murderer, a cop killer, a sexual predator, an abuser, and a child violator, who all secured their liberty via a financial network actively championed by the politician seated directly across from me. This does not constitute mere tangential association, because while she avoided signing the checks directly, she explicitly weaponized her immense platform to direct resources toward those who did." Additionally, when journalists later probed this issue as the horrific realities of these beneficiaries surfaced, she relied on her standard defensive maneuver. Gabbard hesitated purposefully. She pivoted the conversation entirely. From the spectator area emerged a distinct murmur, reflecting an audience no longer shocked by the revelations but thoroughly disgusted by them. Gabbard transitioned her focus toward international boundary security. 110,000 citizens succumbed to toxic narcotic exposure during the 4-year tenure of this administration. The vast majority of these lethal substances breached the southern national perimeter. The vice president received explicit executive authorization to manage this crisis early in her term. Throughout her initial 90 days, she entirely neglected to survey the affected region. During her first half year, she still avoided inspecting the perimeter, Within her inaugural 12 months, the critical border remained completely unvisited by its designated manager. When Lester Holt questioned this glaring omission during a scheduled broadcast, she chuckled dismissively and equated the negligence to her lack of recent European tourism. I desire that specific fatality statistic to truly resonate, because massive numbers frequently blur into meaningless concepts unless properly contextualized. 110,000 equals the entire population density of Green Bay, Wisconsin. Envision every single resident of that municipality entirely eradicated, not by armed conflict or natural catastrophe, but by illicit chemicals flowing unhindered across a boundary the responsible executive never bothered to physically assess. 110,000 closely mirrors the total domestic casualties suffered during the First World War. It required the formidable German industrial military complex 4 agonizing years to inflict that specific volume of casualties. Fentanyl accomplished the exact same lethality metric over a matching time frame. The fundamental difference remains that hostile foreign powers actively sought our destruction, whereas this executive was constitutionally obligated to protect us. She permitted that devastating historical parallel to sink in. Within the public seating area, a grieving mother pressed an absorbent tissue against her tear-filled eyes. She sported a commemorative pin displaying a photograph of her deceased teenage son wearing his athletic uniform. She traveled all the way from Ohio specifically for these proceedings. She remained uncertain if her child's identity would be formally acknowledged, yet she desperately needed to witness someone directly confront the responsible official regarding this toxic epidemic. Nobody vocalized his specific name, but hearing that massive casualty figure confirmed his inclusion within that tragic statistic. Gabbard noticed this grieving parent, recognized the memorial jewelry, and spontaneously altered her planned presentation. A specific individual observing these proceedings currently displays a memorial image of her late child. I remain unaware of their specific identities, yet I recognize her profound loss motivated her arduous journey to witness this exact confrontation. Gabbard redirected her attention entirely toward the politician. You possessed a fundamental obligation to inspect that crisis zone, contact that grieving parent, and execute your duties with basic professional dignity, yet you chose instead to chuckle about overseas vacations. Harris experienced a noticeable respiratory shift, broadcasting rapid, panicked breaths indicative of a physical form recognizing impending disaster before the conscious mind fully accepts it. Her legal defender placed a reassuring palm against her sleeve. She dismissed the contact with a rigid twitch, demonstrating the frantic reflex of someone fighting to maintain structural composure while fearing any external pressure might trigger total collapse. The presiding official checked the chamber's clock. The time read 11:19, marking 79 minutes of continuous testimony. During standard inquiries, this moment usually prompts distracted phone scrolling, the preparation of concluding remarks, and a general deflation of atmospheric tension. This particular environment experienced intense compression rather than deflation. Each passing moment felt increasingly claustrophobic. Every new disclosure carried more weight than its predecessor, and every single person present distinctly recognized they were hurtling toward an inevitable climax. The impending sequence of events will spark endless future debates, not regarding factual accuracy, as every device perfectly captured the unfolding reality for millions of viewers. It will be analyzed relentlessly to determine if the outcome was deliberately orchestrated, though its spontaneous nature is precisely what generated such devastating impact. Gabbard adjusted her physical posture within her chair. She refrained from consulting her documents, avoided her prepared remarks, clasped her hands together, and adopted the tone of a prosecutor entirely certain of the impending response. I wish to discuss the circumstances surrounding Jamal Truelove. Somewhere within the tense environment, a writing instrument slipped and impacted the ground. It produced a sharp, distinct crack against the hard surface. Nobody retrieved the dropped item. During the year 2007, Jamal Truelove was a young aspiring musician residing within a specific urban housing community. He possessed an absolutely pristine background devoid of prior arrests or formal accusations. Your department explicitly targeted him with severe homicide charges. The primary witness received a massive financial disbursement exceeding $60,000 for providing cooperative testimony. Your prosecutorial staff proceeded despite defense attorneys accurately highlighting this highly irregular and ethically compromising financial arrangement. Jamal Truelove endured a guilty verdict and subsequent imprisonment. Throughout his confinement, he suffered multiple violent stabbings and endured extended periods of psychological isolation. He entered the facility at age 22 and remained until his 28th year when the ruling was legally invalidated. Please allow me to emphasize that the judicial conclusion was entirely overthrown. A federal appellate panel officially confirmed severe procedural misconduct executed by the prosecuting team. Truelove secured his freedom and later extracted a massive civil penalty exceeding $13 million from the municipality. The metropolis surrendered those massive funds strictly because your administration aggressively incarcerated a blameless citizen who subsequently suffered brutal violence behind bars. Gabbard shifted her weight forward. However, this specific detail continues to haunt the exonerated man indefinitely. He recounted this profound trauma during media appearances, sworn depositions, and countless journalistic inquiries. As the catastrophic verdict echoed throughout the room, finalizing his unjust imprisonment, he glanced toward your assembled prosecutorial staff and witnessed an official openly grinning. The legislative chamber fell into absolute stillness. Truelove stated that the unearned conviction paled in comparison to the sheer cruelty of that smile. Realizing his personal destruction genuinely delighted the authorities responsible. Gabbard posed her ultimate query without any theatrical buildup, delivering the devastating inquiry with the sterile precision of a military briefing. Madam Vice President, considering an innocent citizen endured severe violence and lost 6 years of his life due to your team's verified misconduct, resulting in a massive municipal financial penalty, were you personally aware that your subordinates actively celebrated his unjust incarceration? Kamala Harris simply needed to issue a standard denial, claim poor recollection, or suggest the narrative lacked complete contextual accuracy. Any among those predictable bureaucratic deflective statements would have ensured political survival and rapid public amnesia amidst the sheer volume of surrounding controversy. What she ultimately executed instead was her habitual, involuntary biological reflex triggered whenever she lacked a coherent defense strategy. She chuckled softly. However, the sensitive audio receiver sat mere inches away, broadcasting the resulting nervous expulsion of air directly to millions of tuned-in citizens. The spectator gallery bypassed mere gasping, plunging into a chilling void where the politician's own erratic, panicked respirations became the dominant acoustic presence. Subsequently, amidst that crushing quiet, Harris recognized the sheer magnitude of her error. Observers could track her horrifying realization not through visual cues but strictly via her panicked respiratory patterns. The respiratory process ceased entirely, mimicking the biological paralysis that occurs when catastrophic information overwhelms the brain's processing capabilities, freezing the lungs as the finality of an irreversible mistake sets in. 3 silent seconds dragged by before a sharp intake of oxygen confirmed she fully understood she had just chuckled about an innocent citizen's wrongful imprisonment on live national television. Gabbard delayed any further commentary. She permitted the suffocating silence to inflict far more damage than any vocalized argument. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds elapsed. She remained perfectly rigid, projecting the intense discipline of a combat veteran who understands absolute stillness provides the most devastating counter to pure chaos. Subsequently, speaking with such incredibly low volume that technical enhancement became necessary for those seated furthest away, the witness delivered her final assessment. There it is, 3 defining words offered like a terminal medical prognosis. The identical response surfaced during the Truelove trial, during your radio appearance discussing narcotics, and during your media interview regarding international boundary neglect. You lack the ability to suppress it because it manifests instinctively whenever factual reality traps you, whenever human tragedy demands genuine empathy, or whenever basic remorse is fundamentally required. You simply chuckle because your long political ascent completely eradicated your capacity for authentic human connection. That does not represent a standard partisan vulnerability, a simple legislative misstep, or a minor public relations hurdle easily managed by crisis consultants. It represents a profound, fundamental defect in human empathy, and millions of voters just witnessed it firsthand. The legislative chamber remained locked in that excruciating lack of sound. Nobody stirred, and nobody dared to whisper. The broadcasting equipment continued to roll while the transcriptionist kept her fingers perfectly poised. Harris remained entirely paralyzed with parted lips, her gaze locked onto an invisible point in space, completely ignoring the witness, the audience, and the lenses, instead adopting the vacant stare of someone watching their own legacy shatter irreparably. Her legal counsel leaned in for a final attempt, whispering loudly enough for the front row censors to capture his urgent recommendation to evacuate the premises immediately. Harris offered absolutely no physical or verbal reaction, sitting immobilized a dozen feet from the witness, enduring a catastrophic reality that no amount of financial influence or political shielding could mitigate. She endured the reality of her own inappropriate reaction permanently echoing across the collective consciousness of the nation. She absorbed the horrifying certainty that this specific audio clip would be endlessly dissected, weaponized, mocked, and analyzed long after her most significant policy achievements faded into obscurity. She internalized the brutal fact that moving forward, her extensive career and pioneering milestones would be entirely overshadowed by a single, involuntary vocal reflex. The presiding official cleared his throat, shattering the intense atmosphere like a heavy object plunging into a tranquil pond. This proceeding is now formally concluded. The wooden mallet struck forcefully at 11:47 in the morning. The resulting crack was abrupt and decisive, prompting a massive collective release of tension from the gathered crowd, resembling patrons unsure whether to applaud or remain silent following a powerful orchestral performance. The formal inquiry terminated shortly before noon on a Tuesday. What unfolded during the immediate aftermath fails to capture the true essence of this historical event. The pundits aggressively debated, the digital platforms surged with activity, the footage was relentlessly manipulated and distributed, and the standard gears of societal outrage processed the spectacle with predictable efficiency and ultimate shallowness. The true narrative centers upon the harsh reality awaiting three distinct individuals upon waking the next morning. Inside a capital city lodging facility, an early digital alarm activated. Kamala Harris terminated the alert and remained motionless for 11 excruciating seconds before visually engaging her surroundings. She understood exactly what digital nightmare awaited her consciousness. She lacked genuine rest, having merely endured the agonizing, restless downtime required when true sleep proves entirely impossible. She sealed her eyes, absorbed the quiet isolation of the suite, and desperately attempted to mentally compartmentalize the disaster into a survivable strategic obstacle. It proved entirely unmanageable. She recognized this grim reality the instant the inappropriate audio escaped her lips the previous day. She retrieved the television controller, activating the monitor only to be immediately confronted by a frozen broadcast image capturing the exact devastating moment of her involuntary reaction. She altered the channel, discovering alternative angles, chaotic pundit panels, highly edited compilation videos merging her various controversial interviews, and even aggressive acoustic wave analyses visually comparing her standard speaking voice against the tragic chuckle she emitted when questioned about wrongful imprisonment. She deactivated the monitor in defeat. The display faded to black, providing a dark mirror reflecting a solitary, fully clothed figure, recognizing she had officially become the exact caricature she spent decades actively trying to avoid. She harbored intense desires to be memorialized for her groundbreaking demographic achievements and historical executive milestones. Alternatively, she recognized her ultimate legacy was now permanently tethered to an uncontrollable respiratory spasm, a devastating audio snippet destined to pursue her relentlessly, much like the severe criminal brand permanently attached to the man she once prosecuted, defying all desperate attempts at bureaucratic mitigation. She rested within the sterile silence of the accommodation, listening to the mechanical climate control unit cycle, experiencing absolute crushing isolation. 600 miles southward along a major interstate corridor, a commercial transit vehicle steadily transported a citizen toward his community. Marcus Williams pressed his brow against the chilled glass while the persistent mechanical hum vibrated through his seating assignment, ironically mirroring the precise sensory experience of the armed transport van that originally delivered him to maximum security, though his current trajectory represented total freedom. His maternal caregiver slumbered in the adjacent seat, her posture guaranteeing severe physical discomfort upon waking. He contemplated adjusting her position but ultimately refrained. She remained entirely active since before dawn, meticulously preparing his wardrobe, navigating massive logistical hurdles, and directly confronting a powerful executive on behalf of her marginalized child, truly earning her uninterrupted rest. His cellular device vibrated urgently. He hesitated significantly before checking the screen. His device remained incredibly active since the inquiry concluded, flooded with communications from relatives, acquaintances, media representatives, and legal professionals. He abandoned reviewing them hours prior, yet this specific notification felt inexplicably different. He observed the incoming message. The incoming text originated from an entirely unfamiliar contact. It communicated an official update from the Regional Public Defense Organization, confirming a massive administrative review of nearly 2,000 distinct cases processed during the specific era in question, explicitly highlighting his personal file for immediate legal reassessment and potential exoneration. He reviewed the stunning communication 3 separate times. 1,900 similar tragedies, representing countless marginalized citizens processed through the identical bureaucratic machinery, resulting in nearly 2,000 individual stories closely mirroring his own trauma, all orchestrated by the exact same leadership that stubbornly refused to acknowledge his humanity. He lowered the communication device. He rested his brow against the cool glass once more as the rural landscape slipped past in the darkness, passing dormant communities entirely oblivious to the fact that a passenger traversing their region was experiencing genuine joy for the first time in nearly a decade. It represented neither an explosive grin nor a boastful display, but rather the subtle structural release of facial tension that occurs when deeply entrenched psychological burdens finally begin to shift, creating a minor physical adjustment entirely invisible within the darkened cabin, but holding immense personal significance. It stood as the absolute antithesis of the tragic chuckle. The chuckle represented a total inability to connect with human suffering, whereas this subtle expression signaled a traumatized soul finally permitting itself a fleeting moment of cautious optimism after enduring years of agonizing emotional suppression. The vehicle droned onward, the exhausted mother remained asleep, the landscape blurred into darkness, and simultaneously on a patio facing the Pacific Ocean, a casually dressed veteran consumed rapidly cooling coffee during the early morning hours. Tulsi Gabbard completely ignored all media broadcasts, having severed her connection following the initial barrage of frantic industry inquiries. She avoided reading the analytical articles, reviewing digital platforms, or gauging the public reaction. She focused entirely upon the rhythmic crashing of the tide. The acoustic experience matched the identical coastal symphony she absorbed during her youth when declaring her intention to enlist, the same noise present before her combat deployment, and the familiar rhythm welcoming her back with permanent psychological scars and the unshakable conviction that true duty demands relentless dedication until the objective is fully secured. The patio entrance shifted, allowing her spouse to step outside and settle closely beside her, ensuring physical contact. He refrained from mentioning the intense proceedings or the resulting media firestorm, instead prioritizing the single most crucial inquiry regarding her emotional state. She pondered the question briefly as her internal conclusion began forming the previous afternoon and solidified completely during her extended flight back to the islands, ultimately acknowledging she felt as though she had successfully fulfilled a profound obligation. He avoided pressing for specific details regarding this internal pact. Veterans comprehend this specific vow, representing the silent commitment forged when witnessing unstoppable injustice, carried meticulously through years of strategic preparation, silently promising the victims that their suffering remains visible and will eventually be addressed when the tactical opportunity arises. She issued this exact promise during a previous national debate when she aggressively confronted the politician, successfully derailing an executive campaign in mere seconds, yet recognizing that brief skirmish merely opened a strategic pathway she still needed to fully navigate. Now she had definitively crossed that threshold. The sea maintained its steady rhythm, the beverage lost its warmth, and the celestial bodies above remained entirely apathetic to political drama, social media trends, and the fragile constructs of human authority visible only to those who actively sought them out. Abraham wrapped his arms securely around her, prompting her to lean inward as they sat peacefully in the darkness, absorbing the relentless sound of the tide, acknowledging it as the solitary earthly force that refuses to deceive, manipulate, or calculate its audience, projecting only ancient, unfiltered honesty completely indifferent to external validation. 600 miles distant on a commercial transit bus traversing the rural South, a man maintained his subtle expression of relief. Inside a sterile capital city accommodation, a woman remained paralyzed in the shadows and suspended within the massive physical and emotional void separating them. The spirits of over 1,500 marginalized citizens finally achieved a semblance of peace. She remained incapable, but the nation successfully witnessed the event, which ultimately proved adequate. Not sufficient to reverse the irreversible damage, restore stolen time, or resurrect ruined lives, but sufficient to demonstrate that silent spirits could finally communicate, that an audience would genuinely listen, and that factual reality would organically destroy deception when granted a public platform and adequate patience, effectively proving that the horrifying, involuntary chuckle was definitely not the concluding audio of this dark chapter. The final resonating tone was actually a commercial transit vehicle steadily vibrating across rural Tennessee under the cover of darkness, safely transporting an exonerated citizen back to his community, a man actively smiling, a man whose specific identity had finally been acknowledged, a man who had ultimately achieved absolute visibility. The forgotten spirits had definitively spoken, and society had finally paid attention.